Joining me now for an exclusive today is one of those rising stars, New York Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Nice to see you again.
Great to see you.
Let me start with, first of all, the thesis there, that some of these tensions, whether it's what's happening in Virginia, the sort of the zero tolerance mindset versus others that are going, let's hit the brake pedal. What we're seeing with the back and forth, frankly, with what you're trying to do with climate change. How much of this you think is generational, or how much of it is ideological?
Well, I think it's both. I don't think that young people and that the energy around climate change, the energy around social justice, the energy around economic justice is just a young people thing. But at the same time, I also believe that, like all big movement moments in American history, young people are putting the gas in the tank to really accelerate our timelines on reaching our goals.
Look, we don't have a committee to decide, okay, you get suspended from your job, you have to resign your job. What do you do in Virginia? What would you like to see happen? What should the process look like? And what is a fireable offense in your mind, or a resignable offense? And what is, let's give you time to explain?
You know, I think this is such an important question, because it's not always just about who did what, but it's how our leadership really deals with the things that they have done. And so what I think when we see a crisis of confidence with some of the folks in Virginia, it's the way they are handling these issues. It's, are we using this as a moment to model what evolution on race looks like? And if you're squandering that moment, right, then you will have a crisis of confidence in your electorate.
You know, there's two paths you could go, right? Governor Northam said, I should stay in office because I can have the conversation better in office. What do you make of that? You
know, if that were true, he would have used that moment to do this.
So you think he might have had that opportunity had he used it in that moment?
Yeah.
And you might have been able to say, okay, I'll give you a chance to stay.
Absolutely.
What about a Justin Fairfax?
Well, I mean, with him, I think what I will say is that the degree of the photos, to that extent, in his specific situation, I don't think there was a way out of it. I will say that. But I do think that, in general, if there was an elected official that was in some degree, you know, there was another person who proactively made a statement that said, hey, when I was 19, I had a mistaken Halloween costume. I'm going to tell you before it comes out, and I want to tell you how I've learned from it and why I'm sorry.
So a lot of this to you depends on how you learn about it.
I think a lot of it does, how you model behavior, how you model behavior as evolution in our nation's consciousness. And if you don't show that, there's no room to lead, lead.
That takes me to Elizabeth Warren. This has been, it feels as if she's always explaining a little bit more.
Yeah.
She's never lied about anything, but there's been she doesn't seem to have given us the fullest answer yet. And there's a lot of people offended by cultural appropriation. Where are you on this, and what do you think she should do that she hasn't?
Well, I think there's two ways to talk about it. So one is, and again, we can use and still have an opportunity. I think here in this situation, I think there's still an opportunity to model what the correct way of navigating these waters look like. And so, for example, I'm Latina. And Latino Americans have a really interesting identity because, especially for me as a Puerto Rican woman, my identity is the descendant of many different identities. I am the descendant of African slaves. I am a descendant of indigenous peoples. I'm a descendant of Spanish colonizers. I am a descendant of all sorts of folks. That doesn't mean I'm Black. That doesn't mean I'm, you know, Native. But it does mean that I can use that as I can tell the story of my ancestors. That doesn't mean that I am that. And so I think in terms of how we navigate that, I think, you know, I look forward to her modeling a public learning process and uplifting those voices.
Has this shaken any concern you have of her being the nominee for the party?
It doesn't. It does not shake my concern with her, because I think all these nominees have time. I think, you know, if this was much closer, much later.
What are you looking for when it comes to this? I think everybody that's announced running that's in Congress has endorsed your Green New Deal, or at least philosophically has endorsed it. We'll get to the details. What are you looking for in a presidential nominee? Because let's be frank here. You've created a political movement. However people want to disagree. So you have potentially you might have some sway, right? Nobody wants to assume anything. What are you looking for in a presidential nominee this year?
Well, first, just corollary. I don't think I've created a political movement. I think I'm part of one.
Fair enough.
But I think in terms of what I look for, I think that it's really about the comprehensive understanding of this moment that we're in right now as a country and our ability to articulate it. And so I don't think that a 2020 nominee can afford to be bad on issues of race. I don't think they can afford to be bad on issues of economic justice either. I think.
How do you define economic justice, though?
So when we talk about things like the role of the labor movement, the role of labor in the working conditions of everyday Americans, when we talk about fighting doggedly for workers, for whether it's wages, whether it's union jobs, whether it's good jobs, I think that is what we're really talking about in terms of fighting for economic justice.
What is there? So you've said that on the issues of race, on the issues, I assume gender falls into that too. But I think those are you would assume you just couldn't get traction on that. Are there specific red lines for you? Medicare for all. Do you have to say you'll do it, or is aspiring to it in the future enough for you?
So I think that we need commitments with teeth. So I don't want to be placated as a progressive. And I know that the progressive movement does not want to be placated in 2020. It's like,
but I guess what's the definition of, so you have, for instance, Amy Klobuchar and Sherrod Brown, I think both are arguing that they'd love Medicare for all, but they're like, it's not realistic. Let's fix Obamacare, or let's do Medicare 50, Medicare 55. Would that be a non-starter for you?
For me, I reject that outright. I reject the rationale.
Okay.
I reject the rationale of saying adopting the same insurance models or a similar insurance model to any other developed country in America is unrealistic. I reject that. I reject the idea that single payer is impossible. I reject the idea that universal health care is impossible. All of these things are possible. When we talk about what I want in a 2020 candidate, I want a 2020 candidate that says we can do these things. We can be audacious. I think we need, in order to overcome this moment, we need to return to our FDR roots as a party. That's what I believe.
Now, one thing FDR had, that we were talking about this today, and my producer he goes, she's got the Green New Deal. He's like, FDR had a massive majorities when he got to push his New Deal through. You guys don't have the massive majority. If anything, you don't have a majority at all on the other side of the Capitol. Yeah. So how do you do it?
So this is a big part of when you actually break down our strategy on the Green New Deal. Even when you go all the way back to our requests in the fall, we were talking about the need to draft or come up with a blueprint by 2020. Because what this really is an organizing play. It's so that by 2020, we can get all of those chess pieces in order. We can get a majority in the House. We can get a majority in the Senate. We can capture the presidency, and we can get things done in that time.
You may have to compromise to get your 60. I mean, you know, Joe Manchin, a very influential Democrat in the Senate, I think we calculated he used the word coal 9 times in his in his opening statement on Tuesday. Yeah. And at the end of the day, Chuck Schumer, your senior senator there, he wants to find 51 senators total to get the majority.
Absolutely, yeah.
How do you find compromise?
So I think when it comes to making those compromises, it's all about the landscape when we get there. So there are some compromises that I think are on the table if we have just 51, but I think some of those compromises are off the table if we have 60. And so I can't speculate as to what the potential compromises would be for any variable makeup in 2020. But the thing that we can control is starting our organizing and being as aggressive as possible now so we can maximize our majorities.
What do you think the best case is to conservative voters, you know, in more rural areas, to say, okay, this is something we got to tackle now, even though they see what's happened in France, and it seems like it impacts the middle to lower middle class more. All of these ideas, taxing carbon, that it just trickles down to the working class.
Well, the reason it's trickled down to the working class in France is because we've allowed corporations to take over who bears the burden of carbon taxes and other taxes. And that's why when we work as a progressive movement here, it needs to be led by everyday people. It needs to be led by workers. It needs to be led by frontline communities, because if we don't do that, that is what happens. And by the way, when you look at who's actually responsible for the majority of carbon emissions, it is the top 10 corporations, multinational corporations in the world are responsible for an enormous amount of our carbon output. So it should not be middle-class Americans, and it should not be everyday people that bear that burden, and it should not be a gas tax at the pump. It should be really the corporations that are responsible for soiling our, for polluting our water and our air.
Is it how do you envision financing this? Is it all through government? Is it just, how are you envisioning financing it that it doesn't end up with the rank and file taxpayer?
So there's a couple of things. One is that I think one way that the right does try to mischaracterize what we're doing as though it's like some kind of massive government takeover. Obviously, what we're trying to do is, well, obviously it's not that, because what we're trying to do is release the investments from the federal government to mobilize those resources across the country. So how do we get there? It can come across a wide range of things. It could be Tennessee Valley Authority style public programs, but it could also be public-private partnerships. It can work down on a municipal level. There could be some potential contracting involved. So it's not as though the federal government's going to wave a wand and say, we're going to do it all ourselves. Secondly, I think one of the big issues, too, is that we have to really address the fact that there's been this broken metaphor of the government as this one-in, one-out piggy bank that Republicans like to say applies to Democratic programs, but when it's their turn at the helm, they just cut whatever check that they want to cut, which is what they did with the tax cut bill. However, the tax cut bill, they lied about in terms of saying that it will generate economic activity. We know that for every dollar you cut in taxes, you get just a couple cents back. But for every dollar that you invest in infrastructure, in building, in jobs, you get more than $1 back.
Little party politics question I got to ask you. You rolled this out today with Senator Markey as your Senate partner on this. Speaker Pelosi announced the Select Committee on Climate Change. Yeah. You weren't on it. You said you were invited to be on it, and you didn't. Yeah. Why don't you want to be on it?
I mean, I do want to be on it,
okay.
but I...
So then why aren't you on it? I'm sorry. It makes a lot of sense to me to put you on it.
No,
why aren't you on
absolutely. So I think a lot of it, frankly, is timing and logistics. So we announced our committee assignments. I did not know if I was going to be asked or selected for the Select Committee at that time. So I wanted to maximize my standing committee assignments. So I was able to get on financial services, which is one of just a handful of exclusive committees that freshmen almost never get on. And I'm on the environmental subcommittee of oversight, which is also a very high-profile committee. And so with that, I'm also on 4 subcommittees. And so when I got the call recently to get on the Select Committee, I just didn't feel like I'd be able to do it justice. However, Joe Neguse, who's an amazing climate activist, is on it.
So you don't feel like this is a snub at all?
I truly do not.
Okay.
The speaker was gracious enough to invite me on it, and I think for me it was...
Would you have had to give up something in order to get on it? Was that the deal?
No, no. I mean, I would...
Would you have to give up financial services to have done this?
I would have to give up doing my job well, is how I feel. And I don't want to give that up, you know.
How committed is Speaker Pelosi to the Green New Deal? Because there's some people that read when she said, oh, the Green Dream, some people thought she was being dismissive. You chose not to take it as a dismissive comment. And good on you. But do you think she's bought in?
So I think we're 100% bought in on addressing climate. For us on the Green New Deal specifically, what I introduced today was a resolution, not a bill. A resolution just has to pass the House. And the substance of our resolution is not a plan. It's the scope of the plan.
Right.
And so I think in terms of the scope of the plan, I think we're going to get there. We launched with over 60 co-sponsors in the House. That is pretty crazy. And so we were able to launch on day one with 60 co-sponsors. We have more rolling in. And I think we may even get a majority of the Democratic caucus on board.
The president spent a lot of time on using the S word, socialism and socialist. It was a not too subtle, I don't know whether it's a dig or a enhancement. I'll let you decide.
I was flattered.
Okay, fair enough. You have said you are a democratic socialist. Can you be a democratic socialist and a capitalist?
Well, I think it depends on your interpretation. So there are some democratic socialists that would say absolutely not. There are other people that are democratic socialists that would say, I think it's possible.
What are you?
I think it's possible. I think.
Do you say to yourself, I'm a capitalist, but?
I don't say that.
Okay.
You know, if anything, I would say I believe in a democratic economy, but.
Gotcha.
But the but is there.
Okay.
So in some ways, whether it's you're coming from, say, Elizabeth Warren's perspective, where she says things like, I'm a capitalist, but we need to have hard rules for the game.
What does the private sector do better than that the private sector, look, government should stay out of X because the private sector does that better?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. There's a lot of consumer goods where the private sector works. And by the way, I think it's important to delineate that just because you're in the private sector you can be in the private sector and be a democratically socialist business. Worker cooperatives are a perfect example of that. It's not about government takeover. It's about how much do workers have a say in your business? Do you have workers on the board? Do workers enjoy a decent amount of the wealth that they are creating? Or is the majority of these profits going to shareholders while you're paying a worker $15 an hour to live in a New York City apartment? And so that, to me, is the difference. It's not that the public sector is democratically socialist and the private sector is not. It's really about a more nuanced understanding of how our economy should work.
You know, somebody who had an interesting perspective on sort of this issue of the larger issue of the Democratic Party, Senator Claire Mccaskill. She lost from a red state. And she was critiquing, not you personally, but I think some people thought she was attacking you personally, but basically saying, hey, it is easy to be a Democratic socialist in a blue district like yours. It is hard to say that same thing and get a Democrat elected in Missouri. So how do you square that with the ability of finding a governing majority?
Well, I square it, first of all, with the direct evidence in 2016 that is not true. And no matter how you feel about Senator Bernie Sanders, he ran in 2016 as a Democratic socialist.
Unapologetically.
Unapologetically, and he won every county in West Virginia. And he won Michigan.
Primaries.
In primaries,
I mean, these are among Democrats. I know that. But that's the point. Among Democrats is one thing, but those independents, right?
And he wins independents. He wins independents. That's the thing. It's because people have this mistaken idea that American politics is on one linear line between left and right. 40% of the American public identifies as independents, and that doesn't mean we're in the middle.
Right.
That means we hate this thing.
So you must be okay with the Schultz idea. And I don't say that as, there's some Democrats freaking out about it, but look, I'm come from somebody who says, what's wrong with more competition is better, not less. Do you think it would be healthier for our system if we had 4 or 5 parties?
4 or 5, I think that's fine. I think that's a
I mean, it sounds like the 2 major parties you feel like don't serve this well.
Yeah, I think that it's totally fine to say a 2-party system is, especially in this time of gridlock, is sometimes a difficult thing to navigate, and I think it's viable after it's a normal thing to say after these years and years and decades of gridlock that are saying maybe something here is structurally wrong. And so, in terms of that as a conversation, I think it's a fine conversation to have. And plenty of other governments do this. And I think that a lot of that goes down to states and city municipalities to experiment with.
You felt the burn last time. You still feeling the burn?
I mean, I love Senator Sanders. I think he's great. And I think in terms of like an endorsement, I joke, I say, don't ask me until the day of the New York primary. But I think the important thing that we need to realize is that I hope we use this primary not as a horse race around personalities, but around our values. And
do you want it to be an ideological fight? Basically, make the decision, Democratic Party. Are you using this left lane, a center left lane, or a right left lane?
I think it needs to be a question for voters.
Yep.
And I think that we should not vote solely based on who we think is going to be subject to X scrutiny from the other party.
Right.
I don't think that's a way of doing anything, because that leads to us governing out of fear. That leads to us casting votes out of fear. And I don't think we get anything done when we operate from such a weak position. I think we come from a place of strength, and the strongest position to be in is to know our values and be committed to them.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, good to see you. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.